Today marks a very important day. At least if you're the type of person who happens to be into vintage home computers. Especially if you're a fan of what happened with them in the UK. As today marks the 40th birthday of the ZX Spectrum, and so I certainly thought it would be worth spending some time putting together a little video marking the occasion. I'm sure there's going to be many others out there doing the same, focusing on their history or their personal feelings and nostalgia for the platform. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to do something a little more me, and that is to offer a little story time before focusing more on the experiences of using the Spectrum, at least in a modern sense. Because, let's face it, I think the Spectrum is a machine with a great software library filled with games I feel are well worth checking out. And over the years of which I've been producing videos, some of those including Spectrum games, I feel as if I've run into many an enthusiast who still wants to hold on to the playground nonsense of those days of yore, instead of being open to other experiences beyond one's childhood allegiances. So that's what this episode is about. From a reflection of how I managed to fall in love with the rubber-keyed beast, before we flick through a bunch of games, both new and old, which I feel are worth checking out. Then finally, how you can best enjoy it in this modern era. So, it's time to start the tape and press any key. Back in the day, the Spectrum was one of those things that could be considered mythical to me. It really shouldn't be much of a surprise, considering A, I'm not that much older than the original machine itself, and B, the whole being based in Australia thing probably doesn't help. Though it did make some inroads down here early on in its life, it never really had the impact that some of its rivals did, that's for sure. So my initial encounters with the machine were primarily in text, mostly from the manuals of various games we bought for other machines. The more common experience was through seeing it mentioned in the many books I'd borrow and devour from my local library's collection. Especially the classics from Usborne, which are thankfully available to download even today, in case you really want to experience the joys of basic programming and the 48K model's distinctive keyword system and see what it's like to type those listings in. Now, if all of this was where my experience had stayed, I think things would have been seriously exciting when I actually got to sit down and play off the machines later on. But there's a little matter of the platform wars, something I certainly felt susceptible to during those days. And it all came down to one game, Chase HQ, specifically because of its infamously terrible conversion to the Commodore 64. And learning that was a port from the Spectrum was one of those moments where the lack of wisdom of youth led to some incorrect views and assumptions being made. So when I finally started messing with emulation, a few years later, it was a genuine surprise to see that I was incredibly wrong, because of course on the Spectrum, Chase HQ is considered a very highly regarded game, and for good reason. And having seen that it was a platform which was more capable than I first thought, it was exciting to start messing about with its many games titles, at least initially through emulation, until I could acquire my own machines many, many years later. Now, let's talk hardware. Like many other 8-bit machines, there are a variety of Spectrum models, and that's even before we get to talking about all the clones out there. The original 1982 machine is of course its most iconic model, with those rubber chiclet keys and compact stature. I've got to admit though my 48K was the first Spectrum I got, it's the one I truly use the least. Sure, it is nice and compact, but honestly, I'm really not a fan of actually playing games on it. Part of that is the video, as by default, the machine was only designed to output RF video. if you are handy with a soldering iron, there is that easy to perform mod which gives you composite video quality. But even then, it's still going to be a little rough when going through something like my setup here, though of course if you're using a CRT display, your mileage may vary. The other part is of course its keyboard. It's cheap because the machine needed to be, and whilst I find it fine enough to type a few commands to load a game, or pick a joystick option from a menu, for extended play, I can't help but find it quite uncomfortable to use. So, thank the maker for joystick interfaces, and for those becoming standardized equipment. Being able to connect a trusty joystick, as I'd use with other machines for serious games playing, is an actual boon to being able to enjoy many of the games I'll talk about later. So when it comes to day-to-day usage, well, it's kind of divided for me. For videos, I tend to stick with my Spectrum 128, which offers a few benefits coming a little later in 1986. The biggest is the keyboard. Sure, it's not up there with the proper keyboards you'll find on other machines or modern hardware, but it's quite an improvement over the old rubber keys. In the rare occasion I've sat down with a game which can only be played via keyboard, it works well enough. Not to the extent where I'd want to be playing that way for an extended period of time though, but it's enough. Then there's the video support, adding built-in composite and RGB video. The latter is real handy and makes for great display quality, as you'll see in most of the gameplay footage shown in the video. Plus, it's still relatively compact. Even with the extra space taken up, it still means there's more than enough room for my preferred device for loading games in with. So when it comes to covering classic Spectrum games on the channel, you can see why this is the machine that I'll pick for all of those reasons above. I don't spend all my time playing games on these systems for capture reasons though, so what about if I just want to set something up and play for a quick session? Well, it might make me sound like a heathen, but that's where the Spectrum Next comes out to play. A large part of that is convenience. Being able to just connect it right into a modern display is so handy. Having to avoid dragging out the upscaling hardware or pull it out of my capture station is real nice for a casual play of something. Then there's the joystick ports, which not only are more convenient to access, being situated in front of the machines, but they can be easily switched to support any of the common standards out there. So, should I find myself wanting to play something that doesn't support the stuff my actual interfaces support, well, I can just easily switch it over and still enjoy it. Of course, there's the fun stuff. Being able to run a game at a proper 200% speed increase is really neat, especially when it's one that pushes the original machine beyond its breaking point. Seeing something like a Freescape game on an 8-bit micro move at an actual frame rate is jaw-dropping, believe you me. Finally, and unsurprisingly, is the keyboard. It's such a serious improvement over the classic Sinclair machines. Though it's not a patch on the more traditional ones offered by the later Plus 2 and Plus 3 machines put out by Amstrad once they had acquired the computers from Sinclair. Now those are ones I don't own. Their size is probably the biggest reason, as whilst it's nice they've got proper keyboards, that means the bigger size of the machine just means they're not going to fit easily into my setup here, which is also impacted by the fact they include a tape drive on the Plus 2s and a disc drive on the Plus 3s. The other thing for me is, whilst it's great they've got joystick ports built in, they're wired up to be physically different than the Atari standards which all the other joystick interfaces use. So you've got to find those joysticks with the grey leads, which means you can't really use new joysticks unless you're handy enough to build adapters. When it comes to 8-bit machines in this modern time, there's only one thing they're really great for: playing games. I mean, seriously, are you going to do word processing on a machine like the Spectrum? Probably not. So, when it comes to gaming on a machine like it, there's certainly a little culture shock you may experience, especially if you're coming to this for the first time. As a simpler micro compared to other machines like the Commodore 64, Atari's 8-bit line, or the MSX family, the Spectrum could certainly look unique and rough when you're watching a game in action. That's all part of its charm, like the infamous colour clash, and the sound from the 48K machine's beeper. You've got to remember, after all, the Spectrum was designed to be cheap at a time when the UK was doing it rough, so all of these limitations don't really need to be discounted, as honestly, creative use of the beeper led to some killer soundtracks on the machine. And those are only bolstered by what was added to the 128K machines, where they now have the AY sound chip alongside the beeper. And I guess that means you're probably asking, what is the Spectrum best suited for in terms of 8-bit gaming? And of course, that's really a bit of a personal mixed bag for depending on what you're after. For me, as much as I love shooters and other fast-paced action games, they're a bit of a mixed bag here, because the Spectrum is of course a machine without dedicated sprite or scrolling hardware. There are still some games which do look amazing and pull off some smart tricks and still feel fluid and responsive to play, but plenty of others aren't. Something I really was impressed by as I started exploring the library is how well it can handle simple 3D visuals. Though there are machines which can pull off more impressive tricks, seeing many a classic in action here run at a good speed is always something worth enjoying. There are plenty of games here which really can do that well, especially coming from a C64 background where, of course, this kind of stuff was tricky and really only happened in a few titles. One of the truly defining genres on the Spectrum was the arcade adventure, whether in sort of more traditional platformy kind of sense or the isometric style. Though the latter is kind of a long-lost genre now, there were plenty of great games in the style on the machine, and it's really one of those things that sums up what it's best capable of. And let's not discount the modern scene. Like other vintage micros, there is a solid catalogue of new games in development and being released out there. In fact, as I'm putting this out, there is a great bundle which you should probably check out so you can get started with playing games on the machine. And you'll find plenty of game development contests which have produced some killer twists in games over the years. Many of those are well worth checking out as well. Now, this video so far has primarily been focusing on the classic machines, but I feel it's worth taking a minor diversion to talk about the next, because the next is new, and it might have a small library, being a mere drop in the ocean compared to the original software library. But there's still cool stuff in development here, and there are cool games already out for it. So you might want to see what those are like. They may not have the limitations the vintage machines offered, but there's still the styles being enforced and in place. And of course, once the next batch of machines arrives, delayed as always thanks to the global situation, I'm sure we're going to see more developers hopping on and making even more exciting things to really push that hardware hard. Finally though, I'm just going to spend a quick moment flicking through a bunch of games that I really enjoy on the machine, both ones from back in the day and some of those which have come out in more modern times. This is just going to be running a batch of footage so you can see a bunch in action and maybe help start building a list of games you might find really cool and might want to check out for yourself. So, it's Space Year 2022, and by this point of the video, I'm hoping your interest has been piked in what the Spectrum offers for a fan of vintage games and vintage hardware. As it's a relatively simple machine, emulation is quite mature, and so it's pretty easy to pick up. Spectaculator may not be free, but if you're a Windows owner, it's relatively straightforward to use and seriously fully featured. On the Mac side of the fence, my pick is Retro Virtual Machine. It offers a fancier interface and gives you a bit of playfulness as a result as you set up your machine and load various programs in. Both of those do wonders for playing original games and will let you run most of the common formats as well, at least when it comes to tapes, discs and snapshots, which tends to be a thing in the Spectrum community. For other platforms, Fuse is probably the most optimal choice, though I haven't really kept up with it, so I don't know how up to date it is compared to some of the other ones. As always, my personal preference is for original hardware. But these days, the stupid prices which these systems go for really puts it into the realm of dedicated enthusiasts only, unless you're rather lucky on that front. But if you do want to go down that path, the original 48K machines are probably going to be the easiest to hunt down in terms of just raw numbers of those made. If you do want a 128K machine, you're probably going to want the original Great Plus 2. Those are closer to the original 128K machines in terms of compatibility, at least in subtle ways, over those later Plus 3 or Black Plus 2A, Plus 2B models. There is of course the Spectrum Next, and clones of it, machines like the Ngo and some of the other things out there. It is the prestige option, but I really love the Next as a package. The other clones aren't quite up there in terms of the polish, but they're just as capable as the Next, outside of the name, is an open platform. And of course you've got hardware emulation platforms like the Mister, which support both those classic machines and the Next. It's a convenient way for you to get started with enjoying the libraries there. But before you want to commit to something like this, plenty of games in the Spectrum's library are playable through your browser, as you'll find on catalogue sites like Spectrum Computing. Though it is worth noting that not every game in their database is playable, or even downloadable, thanks to the challenges related to copyrights and permissions. So you might find there are some big names out there which you can't play in this way, and you've probably got to hunt down in other methods anyway, which can sting a bit when you are getting started with exploring the machine's library. So, it's time to bring this to a wrap. The ZX Spectrum and its family of machines make for an exciting dive into what 8-bit gaming is all about. I'd like to think that if you've made it this far, then this era is something you are open to. And I really hope that you've found some gems you might want to enjoy through watching the video. And perhaps you might want to consider adding the Spectrum to those rotation of machines you do check out games for. Now, I know for myself that even messing about with them emulated for quite a while, and of course owning them in more recent years, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of its library for myself. And I know that many of you watching are going to have different preferences for the types of games you want to enjoy and play compared to myself. So, if watching this video has inspired you to check some stuff out, and you found a few games that you have enjoyed, why not let me know down in the comments? Perhaps I'll throw them on my own list to check out sometime in the future. Now though, it's time for the usual video maker things. Click the like button if you enjoyed the video. If you haven't already, consider subscribing and doing that notification bell thing. If you like the relaxed, thoughtful look I take at checking out games for these old systems, which I do here. If you want to help the channel in more ways than you know, consider signing up for the Patreon feed in case you really want to help this little niche place grow amongst the wilds of the internet. Most importantly though, I just want to say thank you all so very much for taking the time out to enjoy the show.